here this Friday afternoon, and I just told Dr. Pluske that he must be quite the draw for a Friday afternoon. People keep coming in, and I anticipate more will. They must have heard about the cookies and the good speaker. We are really pleased. We're starting a new tradition here to have our Fulbright scholars that are visiting with us be able to present a seminar in our hemisphere room as a sponsored Provost lecture series. And we're very, very proud to have two individuals on our campus right now. Dr. Pluske is our first and who will be presenting. And this is a very unique opportunity in that this is a unique relationship that we have with the Fulbright Commission. We're the only United States university that has this wonderful collaboration. And we're also very pleased that we were able to work with calendars, and we're so very pleased, and I'm going to ask them to stand up, to have Tangerine Holt here with us and Mary Kelly here as well. Thank you. Tangerine and Mary are from the Fulbright Commission, and they're coming to us from Canberra, Australia. So I believe they have the award for traveling the furthest to attend this seminar. So, I know. There's another Aussie back there wondering why I didn't mention him. You live here now, sir. Let me introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, and I am very glad to have the opportunity to do so. Dr. John Pluske is currently the Australian American Fulbright Commission Distinguished Chair in Agriculture and Life Sciences at Kansas State University. And he is indeed our inaugural Fulbright Commission Distinguished Chair. He's a professor in the School of Veterinary and Life Sciences at Murdoch University in Perth, Western Australia. He gained his qualifications at the University of Western Australia, graduating first with a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture degree and then a PhD in 1993. He has since carried out postdoctoral studies on pig nutrition and health in the Department of Animal Science at the University of Alberta, Edmonton, Canada, and the School of Veterinary Studies at Murdoch University. And I look across the audience today and I see a lot of individuals that I recognize that are very, very interested in pig nutrition and health. And I don't know whether Dr. Pluske paid the students and a couple of people that I rode up the elevator with, but they said 5th floor, and I said yes. And going to the seminar, yes. And there's some people that are working with you right now, so they were very excited about coming to the seminar. In 1996, Dr. Pluske moved to the Monogastric Research Center at Massey University in New Zealand, where he worked with pigs, chickens, cats, and dogs. And then Dr. Pluske returned to Murdoch University in Perth in 1999 and has since worked in research and teaching roles both in the School of Veterinary and Biomedical Sciences, as well as several senior roles in administration, including the Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research and Development, before assuming his current position. Dr. Pluske's current research is focused on swine nutrition and the digestive physiology of pigs, particularly piglets and weanling pigs. And also he looks at the immune function and controlling enteric diseases in pigs without antimicrobials. More recently, and he says for better or for worse, and I'm not sure why, you better tell me here. More recently, he has become involved in research investigating alternative sow housing in both gestation and lactation and its effects on sow and piglet behavior, production, and physiology. So for a nutrition professional, this is a treat. I never looked at it in pigs, but I know I'm going to learn something this afternoon. So would you help me in warmly welcoming and appreciating our first inaugural Australian American Fulbright Commission Distinguished Chair in Agriculture and Life Sciences, Dr. John Pluske.
Okay, I think I'm I think I'm all wired up. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, April, for that very nice introduction. And can I just say it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon and coming out to take a listen to what I have to say. And it's wonderful to have the opportunity to be part of this lecture series. So this afternoon, in trying to put such a presentation together, which was a little bit difficult, I have to say, I want to look at, I guess, three major aspects associated with livestock agriculture. So the first is just to examine some global aspects of livestock agriculture and try and put that into perspective. I then want to move on and talk about some of the challenges that as a person working in pork production in Australia, some of the challenges and I guess experiences that I've come across and that we've come across as a nation with respect to welfare and antimicrobial resistance, and then to finish with just a general overview of the role of agriculture, the livestock agriculture rather, in Australia, and to touch on some potential opportunities in the future. So, as we know, well, as hopefully we can recognise, livestock systems occupy about 45% of the global surface area and really are a significant global asset. So researchers have valued that livestock system asset at $1.4 trillion, which is about the gross domestic product of Australia as a nation. Livestock industries employ at least 1.3 billion people worldwide. In the developing world, livestock agriculture directly support the livelihoods of about 600 million poor and subsistence smallholders. And last but not least, livestock are a very important source of nourishment. And calculations have put livestock products contributing about 17% to energy intake, calorie or kilojoule, whatever your preference for terminology, and about 33% to total global protein consumption. So livestock make a significant contribution to livelihoods and to nutrition around the world. Now, many of us are well aware of the forecasts and predictions relating population growth to food demand and food supply. What I've done here is just choose one particular graph which I think shows quite nicely the challenge that the world will face in producing enough food over the next 50 years. So this is a graphic. On the bottom axis here is the year from 1500 to 2050. Obviously records went back to 1500 that they were able to dig out. And on the vertical axis here is global food demand. And for those of us that know about calories, these are terms that I had never heard of before. A petacalorie, this is 10 to the 15 calories, and an exacalorie, 10 to the 18 calories. So these are big numbers describing big amounts of energy. And what we can see here, based again on calculations, is that from 1500 to 2000, the estimated total food production was about 680 exacalories. Now the forecast for the next 50 years is that estimated total food production needs to be at least this amount. Now, of course, and this again is just one example, a lot of these graphs and data make assumptions. So for this particular schematic, it assumed growth trends in per capita food demand are maintained, and I'll come back to that in a little while, that the diversion of food products and inputs to biofuels, which is much more prevalent in the USA than it is in Australia, for example, grows from current levels to 15% by 2050, and that there was no food wastage before 1920, increasing to 30% food wastage during that time, which is an enormous waste in itself. Now, it's not just total food supply that is expected to change. I think there's also a projected change in the nature of that food supply. This schematic shows the relationship between calories or energy by food type. So if I can just walk through this slide for you. Here we have different food types, so cereals, fruit, vegetables, sugars and alcohol, meat and other animal products, which includes milk, eggs, aquatic products, etc. And the way you interpret this particular schematic is that the further you are from the centre, then the greater that particular, then the greater that particular caloric intake is. Now this describes three particular country types. So the first in the lightest blue line are the least developed countries. The darkest blue line are developing countries such as Australia and the US, and such as some of the Asian countries. And then the darkest line, this black line here, are for developed countries. And what you can see is that as the countries, or what you can conclude, is that as a country's per capita income levels increase, dietary preferences are changing. So they're moving away from some of the more lower value products, such as cereals, and moving to higher value products, such as meat and other animal products, as we can see here. Unfortunately, we're also in the developed countries moving towards more sugars and alcohol, and that in itself creates its own issues. This projected demand will actually differ between what can be termed the developing and the developed countries of the world. This table shows the annual per capita consumption and the total consumption in developing countries and developed countries between 2002 and what is predicted in 2050. So we have meat and milk and meat and milk, meat and milk in kilograms per person, and total consumption in millions of tonnes. And what we can see very clearly is that the factor change in total consumption for the developing countries is 2 to 2.5 times that for developed countries. So not only are we seeing changes in dietary preferences, we're also seeing changes in the types of countries that are going to consume those products. And being in Australia, we are very close to Asia and certainly very cognizant about what is happening in Asia. And predictions again are that growth in Asia will more than double the middle class population, which is currently 30%. So in China, that's 400 million people. Population of Australia is 23 million people, to put that into perspective. So that increase in the middle class population will be accompanied by increased purchasing power, potentially adding $3.5 trillion in annual consumer food related spending. Again, to put that into perspective, the gross domestic product of Australia is 1.7 trillion and that of the US is $17 trillion. So this is an enormous change that is being predicted to occur in the future. If we look at how that demand can be broken down, here is just various milk and various animal products broken into meat, different species, and also eggs and milk. And this shows the global production per capita of livestock products between 1970 and 2010. So there's a couple of trends that are quite evident here. One is this linear increase in total meat demand that you can see, and this is not coming from, well, the predictions are that it's not going to come from the ruminant industries, but from the white meat industries such as pork and poultry. We see an increase in predicted demand for eggs, and also after a lag here in the 1990s and early 2000s, an increase in anticipated demand for milk. Now these forecasts and predictions have invariably created much discussion and debate as to how this demand will be actually met. So several publications and proceedings have come out recently tackling the question about just how is the world, if these predictions and forecasts are correct, or even if they're half correct, how is the world going to supply these particular products? And I think what's interesting is that there's been a focus more recently about livestock and global change. Previously there's been much discussion about how we're going to grow more corn or how we're going to produce more wheat. More recently there's been efforts about livestock, really in recognition about the importance of livestock to the global community. So this particular paper was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and invariably the term food security or nutrition security comes up, and certainly some publications published mainly from African countries where these initiatives about food security are really starting to play out. Nevertheless, there's likely to be trade-offs needed in regard to how the world can supply these products without affecting ecosystems, without affecting issues such as weather change, etc., etc. And no doubt that discussion will continue. Now, I don't profess to even begin to have the answers to what is clearly a potentially major world issue. However, I think we need to embrace a holistic approach to all of the issues associated with food security, food supply, and in particular with livestock agriculture. And I think this holistic approach is very nicely encapsulated here at Kansas State University with this particular schematic, which lists various components of this value chain, if you like, associated with the global food system, including processing and storage, utilisation, consumption, health and nutrition and safety, and production. So it's a continuum, and I think that's the approach that is needed worldwide in order to address that problem. And of course, research, teaching, education, and extension and adoption are key planks in addressing any of those particular issues. So whilst we cannot ignore changes in projected demand between developed and developing countries, I want to move on now and discuss some of the challenges facing Australia, a so-called developed country. And being a pig person, or swine person, I'm sorry, I should say swine or hog, but being a swine person, then I'll try and focus specifically in this part of my talk on aspects peculiar to Australia, but that have relevance potentially to the US system, but also have issues and concepts that are familial to all livestock species that we deal with. So what's happened in Australia with regard to meat consumption is that total meat consumption really between 1976, I didn't want to do that actually, there we go. So total meat consumption, and this goes between 1976 and 2011, total meat consumption has actually remained pretty much stagnant. It's gone up a little bit with population increase, but basically total demand for the different for the combined meats, the major meats in Australia being beef, lamb and mutton, poultry and pork has stayed the same, but it's the that has changed. So consistent with the picture I described earlier, we've seen a halving basically in beef consumption and lamb consumption in Australia. So Australians grew up and I grew up eating red meat. Occasionally you'd have a piece of chicken and occasionally you'd have a piece of pork. But there's been a real quantum shift, particularly in the last 25 to 30 years, in the nature of that meat consumption. So we've seen a tripling in poultry consumption, and predictions in Australia are for that to hit about 50 kilograms per capita per person in the next 2 or 3 years. And we're seeing a doubling in pork consumption. So we're seeing a real, I think, major change in the way that Australians, and I'm sure the same sort of situation is happening here in the USA, a change in the way that Australians are eating the meat. Now these changes have not escaped multinational organisations such as Rabobank, who obviously have a vested interest in global markets of all sorts. And this was a quote that I found quite interesting. And I think it neatly summarises what's certainly happening in Australia. That lifestyles are changing in the West, single-person households, double-income households, a greater focus on lifestyle issues, and in already incredibly high per capita meat consumption, are making the industry in the West now driven by finding growth and value in a stagnant or declining volume market. And I think this has been, again, a real seismic shift, at least in Australia, in the last little while. As a consequence, and although Australia is a net exporter of products, and I'll talk about later in my talk, such sentiments such as this and such comments mean that producers and retailers are increasingly looking for product differentiation and increased market share under this particular scenario. Now, entangled within this dynamic, we're also seeing that there is increased scrutiny in the livestock food and fibre production chain. So we're seeing increased scrutiny from consumers, from retailers, in how livestock products are produced all along the value chain. What we're also seeing is that there is a percentage of consumers and retailers, and I think we need to think about consumers and retailers pretty much in the same sort of manner. But we're seeing a change in the way that consumers selecting or preferencing their particular products, be it meat, milk, eggs, etc. So there's been a number of publications that have come out more recently looking at changing consumer preferences for livestock production processes. At the end of the day though, and while a proportion of consumers will be interested in where their food is coming from, it's still price and nutrition that really dictate consumer buying choices. So in Australia, for example, when it comes to red meat, and in particularly beef, sausages, I think you call them links here, sausages and mince comprise about 60% of the total sales of red meat. So that's not to discount the importance of price, and nutrition type attributes, freshness, tenderness, etc. are still very important. But there's a proportion of the consumer market being driven by retailers and or consumer groups and advocacy groups that are more and more interested in the way that their livestock products are being produced, and in a way they are equating this with the quality of those particular products. So I'd like to give you an example. So here's some pork chops, and I have to say that the pork chops, the pork in general in the USA is magnificent. It's much superior than what our particular products in Australia are. But what we can do with a pork chop is, for example, if you're interested in the fat content, you can actually go and have the fat content tested. All right. So the fat content can be tested for so-called quality, but specific details of a production process, such as whether pigs are produced indoors or outdoors, you can't actually really go and test that particular housing system for quality. You can test the pork chop for quality, we can go and test the fat content, but how can we go and test the quality of a pig produced indoors and outdoors? It's much more difficult. And what some in the literature are now calling these sort of food quality traits credence attributes. So what we're seeing, I think, again in a small but growing percentage of the consumer market, is that food quality attributes tend to be associated, but not solely, with handling and or housing rearing practices that conjure up a particular sentiment. And again, I think we need to think about consumers and retailers pretty much in the same sort of manner here, because as I'll show a bit later, retailers, some of the retailers at least, are having a powerful influence on these type of credence attributes. So there's terms in the pig industry that are used at home and no doubt over here, such as gestation or sow store free. I'll talk about that in a moment. Environmentally friendly produce, hormone free produce, antibiotic free produce, free range produce. So these are terms that 20 years ago weren't in the nomenclature really as far as livestock products, but they're now increasingly in the domain and showing up in our supermarkets. Unfortunately, terms such as free range have caused some unscrupulous producers to take advantage of these sort of terms. So in Australia, there is no definition at the moment for what a free range bird is. It's anyone's interpretation of what free range is. And this particular article, and I like this because there's a little bit of journalistic license in the way that this journalist has presented the story. But this particular company in Australia was fined $300,000 recently because it put on its egg cartons words free range and images of hens on open pasture, when in fact those eggs weren't produced from an environment such as this at all. It couldn't be further from the truth. So again, some producers and some retailers, I think, are starting to interpret some of these credence attributes in ways to try and, in a very competitive supermarket environment, gain a little bit of market edge. But to go back to pigs. Now, about 5 years ago in Australia, a series of events occurred, mainly through the media and through online forums, that essentially targeted the use of gestation sow stalls in the Australian pig industry. So sow stalls are these structures here, and these sows are kept, or have been kept traditionally in this sort of environment after they are weaned and during their gestation or pregnancy period before they are then moved into another barn to give birth to their piglets. This was the depiction on the top of the slide here was a particularly telling story, because this is still a fellow called Andrew Spencer, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Australian Pork Limited, which would be similar to your NP, National Pork Producers Council here. And this was an interrogation rather than an interview by a former journalist from 60 Minutes, who really interrogated Andrew about the use of gestation sow stalls in the Australian pig industry. The interview that was shown on 60 Minutes was actually very different than the footage that was actually taken by the television crew. So there was some manipulation around the type of story that was presented at this particular time. And then there are activist groups, advocacy groups that are really advocating change in the way that livestock is being produced in Australia. Now, as a consequence, and as shown in this slide, about 80% of the total sow herd now in Australia is kept under group housing conditions. Right? So 4 or 5 years ago, 100% would have been kept in these sow stalls like this. Now, within 4 or 5 years, 80% of the industry has gone to a group housing situation. It's been a quantum shift in such a very short period of time. And Rivalea Australia is one of the largest pork producers in Australia. 4 years ago, this was a barn or a shed showing these individual sow stalls. They retrofitted that particular barn, and 2 years later, they are now 100% group housing system. And as I said, 80% of the Australian herd, sow herd, is now kept under these particular conditions. Now, as you can imagine, this has caused, or did cause, many teething problems, many welfare sort of issues, many production issues. There was a decrease in the number of piglets that were born, increased aggression of sows fighting as they were mixed together, farrowing rates were reduced by half in some instances, and not to mention the capital cost of retrofitting and or building new barns to fit with new compliance around how sows are maintained. So this has been a really major shift in the Australian industry. However, it's not only vested animal rights groups that have forced these changes. It's some of the retailers. And Coles is a supermarket chain in Australia. It commands somewhere between 35 and 40% of the total market share, and with another supermarket chain control about 80% of the total supermarket volume in Australia. So around the same time as these changes were happening, and there was animal advocacy groups and the social media campaign, Coles embarked on a strategy to try and differentiate themselves from their competitors, and came up with these sort of slogans. Coles were committed to providing customers with high standards of food, which means taking into account environmental, financial and social issues such as animal welfare when sourcing meat, eggs or produce. So the kind of implication there is that current production practices don't have high standards of food. Well, I mean, we can debate that particular issue, but this is 35 to 40% of total supermarket share in Australia going down this path of products being so-called responsibly sourced. And if you buy pork in Australia now and you buy it from Coles, then this is the little label that accompanies the package of pork that you buy. Sow stall free for better welfare. Now, we can debate and argue about sow stall free, sow stalls, whether that's better for welfare or not. The reality is that this supermarket chain went down this path. If you're a pork producer and you want to sell pork to Coles, then that's what you have to do. And that's really been, again, a seismic shift, and reasoning and arguments and discussion about, well, what is better welfare, what is the science behind some of these decisions. It's somewhat lacking, would be a polite way to express that. And just last month in our state, Western Australia, which is a very small pork producer, Coles, the national supermarket chain, have chosen a number of very small-time pork producers to basically supply nationally free-range pork to Australian consumers. And accompanying these pictures were comments such as this: our pigs live outside all year, meaning that they benefit from the cool climate and clean environment throughout the region. We hope that the new contract and future growth will mean that pork out of the Plantagenet and Great Southern region, which is in the southwestern part of Western Australia, receives national recognition for clean, green, ethically produced meat. So this is now on the national stage. It's going to be around. I've no idea what sort of contracts and prices these producers are going to be paid, but commonly the pre-weaning mortality, or the number of piglets that die under these free-range conditions, is much higher than, for example, piglets that are kept indoors. So while Coles may come out with these particular claims, there are serious, I think quite serious production and welfare issues behind some of this, which do not necessarily always meet the consumer's eyes. And it's not only in Australia that these changes are happening, as I'm sure you're aware. This was an announcement a couple of months ago from Nestle, a global change in their particular policy associated with purchasing particular animal products. Benjamin Ware quoted as saying that we know that our consumers care about the welfare of farm animals, and we, as a company, are committed to ensuring the highest possible levels of farm animal welfare across our global supply chain. So I think what's happening in Australia is indicative of what has happened certainly in other parts of the world, such as in Europe, but will also be at the forefront of changes that may happen in other parts of the world. Okay, so I now want to move on and discuss another particular challenge, which is not only related to Australia in some way, but I think is very much a world global policy health issue. And it's this time in relation to the whole issue of antimicrobial resistance. Again, an animal advocacy group in Australia, Animals Australia, the Voice for Animals. This is taken from their particular web page. Super scary, animal agriculture linked to global superbug threat. And for people that are reading this and come across these sort of images, and I'm sure you've seen other images about superbugs and everyone dying and being affected by antibiotics, then it starts to conjure up, again, opinion, and starts to conjure up questions about how our livestock products are produced. But first, what's antimicrobial resistance? So I'll just spend a little bit of time going through some basic understanding and background in relation to this topic. So microorganisms, so antimicrobial resistance really refers to microorganisms that have developed the ability to resist the antibiotics or other antimicrobials that are used in their particular environment. There's a bit of a distinction between antibiotics and antimicrobials. So antibiotics are natural substances, they're perfectly natural substances produced by one microorganism that have the ability to kill or inhibit the growth or multiplication of other organisms. Then there are antimicrobials, and antibiotics are one type of antimicrobial, but not all antimicrobials are antibiotics, if that makes sense. So for example, antiviral drugs and antifungal drugs are also antimicrobials, but they're not antibiotics. So again, when we're talking about this discussion and part of this debate, we just need to be talking about or being on the same page when we're talking about these sort of issues. Antimicrobial resistance in humans and animals occur when antibiotic levels that would normally prevent the growth of or kill a particular bacterium essentially become ineffective because of a genetic change in that particular bacterium. That can come from random changes in DNA, so genetic mutations, and or the movement of antimicrobial resistance genes contained within the particular microbe from one bacterium to another. And there's very good evidence that these changes do happen. It's undeniable, these changes do happen. The continued use of an antimicrobial under those conditions then allows what are called resistant bacteria to survive rather than be killed. I wanted to show you this particular graphic, and this comes from human medicine, because it shows that around the world there is a positive relationship between total antibiotic use and resistance. So this is a graphic looking at total antibiotic use defined as the daily dose per 1,000 population per day from a number of different countries where accurate records were being able to, were collected. On the y-axis is penicillin-resistant Streptococcus pneumoniae. And you can see quite clearly that as total antibiotic use increases, then the proportion or the percentage of this particular bacterium resistant to penicillin actually increases, right? And that's, in some ways, that's a perfectly natural anticipation that as antibiotic use increases, then there will be resistance developed within those bacteria or some of those bacteria to that particular antibiotic, in this case penicillin. Now, in human health and medicine, some potentially pathogenic bacteria resistant to antimicrobials may enter the food chain. So that is a potential health concern. But we also need to recognise that there are bacteria, excuse me, that there are bacteria in the environment that can cause human disease without being resistant to antibiotics, such as some Salmonella, Campylobacter, Yersinia, Listeria, those type of species that can cause illness and in some cases death without necessarily being resistant to an antibiotic. So we need to remember in the whole argument that those particular instances can occur. The problem is that when there are infections caused by antimicrobial resistant bacteria, then because the particular antibiotic may be ineffective, then those patients can show increased morbidity or sickness, increased time in hospital, and show higher mortality rates. Now, if we just now look at the use of antimicrobials in food animals, excuse me, and there's four major ways that antibiotics can be used in farm animals, in food animals, sorry. In fact, any animals, including companion animals. So there's antimicrobials can be used for the prevention of disease. This is where there's a known disease risk present and the antibiotics are administered to prevent infection of animals. There's the control of disease when the disease is present in a percentage of the herd or the flock, and antibiotics or other antimicrobials are administered to decrease the spread of that disease while clinically ill animals are treated. There is the treatment of disease or therapeutic use where antibiotics are administered to treat sick animals. And then there's a final use, and this really, at least in relation to the pig industry, is the most contentious. And this is the use of lower levels or lower doses of antibiotics for growth promotion. And these tend to be called antibiotic growth promotants or AGPs. And this certainly in the pig industry in Australia and I believe here in the US is the most contentious use of some of these antibiotics. And this is when antibiotics are administered, usually in the feed, but they can be administered through the drinking water to increase growth rates and improve feed efficiency. Now, before moving on, I really want to point out that antibiotics are one part of the toolkit, if you like, for producers of any particular food animal to manage their particular animals. It's part of the toolkit along with management, along with nutrition, along with welfare imperatives, along with stock personship. It's part of the total toolkit. So we need to recognise that producers have a range of tools available for them in order to maintain the welfare and production of their particular animals. And again, I think that particular issue is lost in some part of the discussion and debate. I just showed you a graphic between the use of a particular antibiotic, penicillin, in human medicine and resistance. Well, surprise, surprise, exactly the same thing happens in food-producing animals. This is a European study that looked at the relationship between the average antimicrobial use ranking and the average antimicrobial resistance to a bacterium called Escherichia coli, or E. coli, which is a very common bacterium that lives in the gut. It lives in our gut. It lives in the gut of all animals. And these particular countries in Europe, the way to interpret this particular graph is that the higher the average antimicrobial use ranking, so Belgium and the Netherlands, for example, in this particular study were found to use the most amount of antibiotics for cattle, both beef and dairy, pigs and poultry. So those particular countries that used the most antimicrobials also had the highest levels of antimicrobial resistance. And it's interesting to note that countries such as Sweden and Denmark in Europe, which banned, for example, the use of antibiotic growth promotants about 15 or 20 years ago, it's interesting that they have some of the lowest levels of antimicrobial resistance. That's not to say it doesn't exist, because it does. And if you look at the data in Denmark and Sweden, for example, their use of antibiotic growth promotants, the most contentious, has plummeted. It's absolutely plummeted. But their total antibiotic use in the pig industry has not changed. And in fact, it's increasing because there's been more application of therapeutic antibiotics, because animals still get sick and their welfare needs to be looked after, and antibiotics are one way of managing the welfare, improving the welfare and production of those animals. Now, I simply don't have time today to delve more deeply into some of the underlying issues, but if we look at the proposed epidemiology of antimicrobial resistance, it's complex. I mean, you could talk about this particular topic for weeks. And it's not just the food animals, it's not just livestock animals that are involved in this particular chain. If we look at this, it's companion animals. There's food animals for sure, but there's also the human part aspects of it. There's abattoirs, there's what happens with respect to planting of seeds and fruit. There's agriculture, there's rendering, there's soil and wildlife. There's a whole raft of issues that actually need to be addressed around this whole issue of antimicrobial resistance. Nevertheless, and despite some very good science being conducted in both humans and animals related to the issue, there almost seems to be an impasse in this particular debate about antimicrobial resistance. Who is right? Who is wrong? So we see these type of messages appearing on the internet, and then countering those are messages such as this from the National Pork Producers Council. I'm not here today to say who's right or who's wrong. There's debates already happening in the public environment about that, but I think it's interesting that there is this type of approach to the subject. And we have, just last year, a prominent Australian medical scientist came out with this sort of statement. He's probably wishing he could retract that at the moment, but this is the sort of atmosphere under which this current debate is occurring. But in Australia, Australian Pork Limited, which is the national representative body for Australian pork producers, for many years now, their stated aim, if you like, for the Australian pork industry is to minimise the use of antibiotics through vaccines and better management of the animal. So they advocate the use of prudent antibiotic use in both humans and animals as the key to ensuring that development of resistance in certain bacterial populations in both groups will not occur. It's not saying you cannot use them, because Australian Pork Limited, like many organisations, recognise the benefits of using them, but it's titrating that back to prudent antibiotic usage. And in terms of the research program that myself and colleagues have been involved in, and which I'm very much looking forward to being involved in here at K-State, what we've been doing for the last 15 or 20 years, really under that umbrella of the prudent antibiotic use, is to look at various nutritional and or management alternatives for the use of antibiotics or antimicrobials for pigs. So these are just some examples of some of the work that we've looked at, looking at, for example, lowering the protein content of the diet fed to pigs, looking at different fibre ingredients, looking at zinc oxide as a way of trying to overcome some of the gastrointestinal issues that are linked to or involved in antibiotic use. But is there some middle ground that we can look at in all of this? Why does there have to be an all or nothing type of approach? So what I'd like to do now is just quote some work that was done here at K-State just very recently, which looked at a way to possibly minimise the use of antimicrobials during a particular production phase. So this was an experiment done in young pigs. They were just weaned off their mother at about 21 days of age. And in this particular experiment, they were fed a number of diets. So these are antimicrobial agents. Cu stands for copper, CTC and TYL are two antibiotics used in the pig industry. So there are various combinations of these antimicrobial compounds, being minerals and or antibiotics. These were then fed for 21 days. Before that, the diet without any of these particular antimicrobial compounds was fed, and some samples of the faeces were taken and analysed for resistance genes in a particular bacterium. So this was a pre-treatment. We then had, this particular experiment rather, had 3 weeks of feeding these particular diets, and then for the last 2 weeks there was a washout period. So the pigs went back to this basal diet that was devoid of any of these particular antimicrobial compounds. So there was a basal pre-collection period or pre-treatment, 3 weeks of feeding, and then a washout period of 2 weeks. Fecal samples were taken and the level of resistance genes in a particular bacterium was analysed. And this is just one example of the data that was found. Here we have pre-treatment, and this is the proportion of a resistance gene found in one of the bacterium that was analysed in the faeces. First, we can see that the proportion of resistance to the antimicrobials was quite low. But 3 weeks of feeding, in all of these treatments, it went up. But what happens when you take these products out for the next 2 weeks is that the level of resistance decreases basically to baseline. So I think this is a really neat example of potential strategic use of antimicrobial compounds to reduce the proportion of resistant bacteria. Clearly there's much more work to be done in this area, but I think with good science and particularly education, I think education along with the science has to be an integral part of this whole debate and discussion. With good science and education, hopefully resolutions around this particular discussion can be made. The final part of my presentation today is briefly to review the role of livestock in Australia now and into the future. So for those of you that may not be familiar with what Australia looks like, this is a map of Australia. Myself and my wife and 2 boys, we're from here. And it's a very long way from Manhattan, Kansas. But basically 90 to 92% of Australia's population lives in Perth, Adelaide, Hobart, Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney or Brisbane. So we are coastal dwellers, if you like. And the yellow part of the map really describes dryland cropping and the main livestock agriculture, I guess, reservoirs for Australia. People often ask, what's out here? Well, there is what's called a pastoral cattle industry. These are cattle that have very low reproductive rates, very low levels of productivity, but are farmed or herded out there would probably be a better term. And then they mainly end up as hamburger meat, which ends up in your McDonald's restaurants. Or they're shipped on boats to countries in Asia and into the Middle East. So it's low input, depending on whether it rains or not, low profit, no profit, and a very tenuous, certainly a very tenuous industry to be involved in. Australia used to have a lot of sheep. I think 175 million sheep about 25 years ago. The current sheep population is about 60 million. So really reflecting changes again, I think, in the way that consumers are eating their meat and also in relation to just some of the economics associated with keeping livestock. But what is the value of agriculture to Australia? Well, the sector contributed about 3% of overall GDP. Mining contributed about 11% of gross domestic product to Australia. But with the value-added process of all the economic activities supporting farm production, farm inputs that occur, the agriculture's contribution to Australia is about 12% of GDP. So it rises to a significant proportion. I'm afraid I don't know what the role or the contribution of agriculture in the USA is to GDP, but in Australia it's an industry that is often very much maligned, but when you look at the economics, certainly contributes substantially to Australia. Australian farmers produce about 93% of Australia's daily domestic food supply and export about 60% of total production. So we're a net exporter of many agricultural produce, including livestock products. And this has been very interesting in terms of a discussion around Australia being the food bowl of Asia. And a significant debate at the moment is the investment by particularly Chinese companies in Australian food production companies, in particular dairy and cereal production. And it's quite a contentious issue. The fact remains that British and US companies have been owning agricultural production companies in Australia for 100 years. But it's still a contentious issue. And someone from the Australian Farm Institute has done a calculation that Australian food exports provide sufficient energy intake for about 62 million people in the world. Australia's 23 million, so we're not the food bowl of Asia by any means. There's other countries that can, will also supply that type of food produce. In terms of the share of livestock products to agricultural export earnings, and this mirrors the gross value of production of livestock products. Livestock, so wool, dairy, beef and veal, lamb and mutton, represent about 33% of all agricultural export earnings. Beef in particular is the major livestock industry in Australia and the major export industry, and always features in negotiations around free trade agreements, also issues between trading between different countries, and so on and so forth. However, and I guess in part to some aspects of the presentation I gave earlier, there's really been some soul searching being done in Australia of late related to future opportunities in food and fibre. And a report that was produced earlier in this year that was commissioned by the Australian Research Council, the funding arm, if you like, of the Australian government, they produced a report called Food and Fibre, Australia's Opportunities. And I think one of the key conclusions from that report was that in the future, Australia needs to basically effectively balance sustainability and production growth, and that should be a key competency of agriculture into the future. Importantly, the goals of sustainability and production should not be mutually exclusive. So I think there's been a recognition from this report, and it was put together mercifully by a lot of agriculturalists who actually knew something about what the subject matter was. But the recognition is around sustainable production, sustainable intensification into the future. And I think that's going to be a key term in terms of how livestock agriculture in the world goes into the future. So some of the opportunities that this report threw up were, sure, there's productivity increases within the current livestock industries through domestic and export markets. There needs to be some recognition of the development of new industries that don't necessarily compete for natural resources that are currently used in agricultural industries, such as aquaculture. But the main emphasis of the opportunity was around increasing the value of livestock products. Again, back to my earlier point about total meat consumption, a stagnant or slowly increasing market. There needs to be some differentiation in the marketplace about livestock agricultural products. And components of that particular item related to capturing a greater proportion of the value chain within Australia, production of high-value fresh produce, transformation of food commodities to higher value products, and credible certification and authentication of brand Australia products as safe quality food of known provenance. So known origin and known safety. So brand Australia for those that may come to Australia in the future, then you may start to see some of this in the news. But importantly, and I think a very salient point of that report, was the recognition of the role of science and collaboration. And I'd just like to finish a couple of slides on this particular topic, because the report recognised that international collaboration is a critical factor in the ready application of breakthrough science and technologies for Australia. We're a small country. We're 1/15 or 1/16 the size of the USA. And in terms of livestock agriculture, the number of scientists, the number of extension people involved in livestock agriculture is diminishing, unfortunately. And partly in recognition of that, improvements relevant to the livestock and fibre industries will depend, or also depend, on strengthening research links with leading research institutes in Europe, North America, China, India, Brazil, and our participation in leading international consortia. And just to put that into perspective a little bit for you, this was the outcome of the last round of what are called discovery research projects. So this is a competitive funding system conducted or run rather by the Australian Research Council across all aspects of humanities and arts, biological sciences, environment, engineering, etc., etc. And what is a very interesting statistic is that 24% of all successful research grants funded by the ARC involve collaboration with the USA. And in fact, in 2011, the USA was Australia's #1 science collaboration partner, and that extends through to agriculture as part of that. So there is already a very key component of collaboration between Australia and USA. Of course, Australia and the USA compete nationally on many stages as well. We simply cannot compete with you as far as pork exports go, I can vouch for that, but on other aspects of trade and competition, then Australia and the USA are fierce competitors. But often it's parking that to one side and looking at joint problems together that can prove benefit to both parties. And I think that's where that report was really aimed at looking for in the future. And locally, we already see some examples of that here at K-State between the Cooperative Research Centre for Plant Biosecurity and Kansas State University, and also, and into the future, the important relationship between K-State and the Australian American Fulbright Commission. And as a case in point, last week, a scientist and general manager from Australia visited here on campus, Tony McLeod, and he's part of the Oz to Oz Fulbright Scholar, and he presented a seminar on water management. Now, I don't really have time today to talk about water management. I would have liked to, because it's a subject quite dear to my heart and dear to Australia as a very dry continent. But Tony came here and I thought presented a very nice overview of issues relating to water management in a major river system in Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin, and also tried to apply that to some aspects of water management here in, I think, Western Kansas, southwestern Kansas. And I think his participation and discussion with K-State faculty was quite well received, or very well received. So just to finish this afternoon, April, then I think I just want to go back to the three topics that I put forward today as part of today's lecture around perspectives. And I just wanted to reinforce the importance and relevance to global livelihoods and economies of livestock agriculture. And its importance and relevance will continue to increase. There's no doubt about challenges, not only in terms of, again, if we believe predictions and assumptions and forecasts, not only about supplying protein, supplying milk, supplying eggs, but challenges around issues such as sustainable intensification. How can we, as a world, as countries, Australia, USA, how can we contribute or be part of that global food system while recognising some of the trade-offs that undoubtedly are going to be pressed upon us? And I think some of those challenges relate to finding growth and value of livestock products in a stagnant or declining market. I gave you the example in Australia, and also in the face of challenges in relation to the pork industry. I talked about welfare and gave you hopefully a bit of an idea of what's happening in Australia with the pork industry, and also about the antimicrobial resistance and issues associated there with food safety, and again the link that some advocacy groups are making in terms of livestock agriculture. And finally, I just wanted to touch on the important component of livestock to Australian agribusiness and the need, I think, in a way that needs to be addressed quite urgently, to maintain and increase strategic international partnerships that have benefits for all. So finally, I'd just like to thank the Australian American Fulbright Commission Association, and Tangerine and Mary are here today, and thank you for all the support that you've given me and my family and I in regard to us being able to come to K-State. Much gratitude goes to Kansas State University, from the Office of the President through to international admissions to facilitate the enrolment of James and Rob here at K-State, and they're having a great time. Housing and Dining for getting us settled in. To Ken Odie and Mike Tokash in particular for facilitating my transition into what I find a very dynamic and vibrant department, and thanks Bob as well. And finally to Joe, who I must give much credit for this particular presentation, and James and Rob for coming along today. And I just want to leave you with hopefully some pictures that won't make you too jealous and won't bring too many memories of home back to us. But this is just a photograph of Perth. You'd be interested to know, and probably consistent with all state type consul generals around the world. The consul general to Western Australia lives right there, with a commanding view over Perth and over the Swan River. There's just the swans, state faunal emblem, what's called a kangaroo paw, our state floral emblem. This is a port of Fremantle, which empties into the Indian Ocean, and Perth is up the estuary here, about 12 miles east of Fremantle. White beaches, with plenty of those. You've just got to watch out for sharks when you dive in the water. And people often ask, well, I've got 2 weeks and I want to see Australia, or I've got 2 weeks or I want to see Western Australia. What should I do? It'd be the same as if we asked, well, I'm coming to the States for 2 weeks, where shall I go? And you go, oh, gee, it's all too hard, because it depends really what you want to do. But Western Australia is 10 times the size of Kansas and has 2.4 million people, and 2 million of those live in Perth. So it gives you a bit of an idea about what remains in the rest of the state. And these are just some images of particularly up north, right up in the northwest, to more equatorial type climates, and also down south in the southeast corner of the state. Just to give you a little bit of taste of some of the type of environment that you can experience. So with that, I'd like to thank you for coming this afternoon, and we'll leave it at that. Thank you. Oh, thanks.
I'm sure that questions have been probably arisen that you'd like to pose of our speaker. Please feel free to, and we're going to pass the microphone around a bit.
Hey, I'm Victoria Volkova from the Veterinary College, and I have a question. I was recently reviewing international systems for antimicrobial resistance monitoring in livestock and for antimicrobial use, and I couldn't find anything for Australia. So does Australia have a system for monitoring antimicrobial surveillance in animal bacteria and antimicrobial use in livestock?
Thanks for the question. The question was around whether Australia has basically a national surveillance type system for antimicrobial resistance. No. Is the simple answer. So it was the subject of a national discussion paper last year, recognising that for human medicine and for animal medicine, if you like, there is no national type surveillance system similar to DanMap or something that you would see in Denmark, or I know you have one here, and forgive me for NARMS, that's it. So no, we don't have one. To date, it has relied on, I guess, ad hoc type investigations and studies. There's certainly been surveys done in different animal species. A couple of years ago, there was a paper published which was basically a producer survey from pig veterinarians in Australia looking at levels of antibiotic use. It didn't address resistance, but what it tried to do was associate antibiotic use to antibiotics of low concern to human medicine. So looking at tetracycline, ceftiofur, macrolides, those type of antibiotics. And basically the finding from that study, and again I can only speak for the pork industry, I'm not sure about the cattle industry, but basically the finding from that study was that that there was quite low levels of antibiotic use anyway, in particular antibiotic growth promotants, very low levels of use. And second, that the use of antibiotics that favour resistance in some bacteria that could pose a threat to human medicine was also relatively low. So, I mean, the other part of one reason for, I think, that low level of antibiotic use is that if you want to supply, and again back to the example with Coles, the supermarket, if you want to supply pork to Coles, you can't use antibiotics unless under prescription from a veterinarian. So again, it's a change that's happened, forced basically on producers by a supermarket chain, and as a result, producers and we've been sort of part of, I guess, helping out producers in some way look at some of these alternatives, and they're not all nutritional, they're management, a whole host of factors, looking at ways to try and reduce antibiotic use, because Coles have auditors that come around and check records, and it's part of the supply standards now that's written into manuals. So hopefully that answers your question.
John, it all boils down to the resistance of the epithelial cells of the gut to infection. Any compounds you know of, not antibiotics, which make the epithelial cells more resistant to infection?
No, I don't know.
I don't know. No basic studies like, using compound and seeing the epithelial cells grown in tissue culture or something, that they become more resistant to that particular E. coli or any infection.
So are you talking with respect, for example, to Fimbriae on the epithelium, or other aspects related to epithelial function?
This is a basic study I'm talking about, that this will be tissue culture cell.
Okay.
But, in animals, if it happens, I don't know of any.
I'm not aware, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of any of those studies. You may be more aware.
Like you were showing, I thought, that some of the compounds like copper and zinc and other things, anybody done those kind of studies?
Oh, yes, sorry, yes. So, I mean, we've known for many, many years that compounds like copper sulfate and zinc oxide are mostly effective at reducing or controlling, for example, diarrhea after weaning in piglets. I'm not sure the exact mechanism has ever been resolved as to how, for example, zinc oxide works. I did a review last year and I came up with about 8 different plausible reasons as to why zinc oxide could have an effect on, for example, reducing intratoxigenic E. coli in the gut of young pigs. But I think the fact that it is an anti-inflammatory type compound, it's not very well absorbed, so perhaps just the presence in the brush border membrane along the epithelium, perhaps simply the high concentration of zinc or copper has a bacteriostatic or bactericidal effect on particular populations of bacteria in the gut. Look, I know that there's many different compounds that are being investigated, some of which are better researched than others, that are really aiming to look at minimising the use of not only antibiotics but also some of these mineral antimicrobial compounds. But I think in general production, at least in the pig industry, that the jury is still out on quite a lot of those products, and really effective control of certain pathogens comes down to using some of the tried and proven compounds that are legally able to be used in the industry.
Other questions or comments? Well, will you join me again in thanking our speaker?